The blue lights weren't there a second ago. You're driving normally, hands relaxed on the wheel, maybe thinking about dinner or the next stop, and then suddenly that reflection starts flickering in your mirror, red and blue. The kind that makes your stomach drop, even when you know you've done nothing seriously wrong. You signal, you pull over. The world outside the car feels like it slows down in a strange, uncomfortable way. Every second stretches. You hear footsteps behind you before you see the officer. And now you're sitting there, window slightly down, heart beating harder than you want to admit, wondering what this moment is going to turn into. Let me ask you something real, something most people never openly talk about, but almost everyone has experienced or feared at least once. What was the most uncomfortable or confusing moment you ever had during a traffic stop, or when a police officer questioned you on the roadside? And I want you to actually think about it, because whatever your answer is, that experience matters more than you might realize. Share it in the comments, not just for conversation, but because understanding how people experience these stops is exactly how you start to see what most new drivers completely misunderstand about the road, about police behavior, and about their own rights. Because here's the truth most people don't find out until they are already pulled over again, or until a situation escalates faster than expected. Traffic stops are not just about driving rules. They are about behavior, timing, perception, and decision-making under pressure. And if you don't understand how all of that connects, even a small mistake can turn a simple stop into something far more stressful than it needed to be. Now, before we go deeper, you need to understand something foundational about driving in the United States. When you first get your license, most people think they're learning road rules. But what they're really being introduced to is a system of expectations. Not just what you are allowed to do, but what every other driver expects you to do, and what law enforcement expects you to know when they approach your vehicle. Every state has its own driver handbook, but the core principles stay surprisingly consistent across the country. You are expected to obey traffic signals without hesitation. You are expected to maintain safe speed relative not just to the posted limit, but to road conditions. You are expected to yield properly, signal clearly, and maintain control of your vehicle at all times. These are not just rules written for exams. They are the baseline standards officers mentally check against when they decide whether your driving behavior looks normal or suspicious. And that word, normal, is more important than most new drivers realize. When an officer decides to pull you over, it is rarely random. It is usually triggered by something that breaks expected driving patterns. Maybe you drift slightly between lanes. Maybe your braking is inconsistent. Maybe you didn't signal early enough. Maybe your vehicle registration light is out. Or maybe it is something more serious like speeding, rolling through a stop sign, or tailgating. But here's what most people don't think about. The stop itself is not the beginning of the encounter. From the officer's perspective, the interaction begins long before they ever walk up to your window. It begins the moment they decide your vehicle has drawn attention. Everything after that is observation, assessment, and controlled communication. So when they approach your car, they are already reading you. Your hands, your eye movement, how quickly you respond, whether you are overly defensive or unusually quiet, whether your passengers are moving around. Even how your car smells or how cluttered it appears inside can influence how the interaction unfolds. Not because officers are trying to judge you personally, but because they are trained to look for inconsistencies between expected behavior and actual behavior. This is where new drivers often make their first serious mistake. They assume the interaction is purely legal. It is not. It is also psychological. Let's slow this down with a real roadside scenario. Imagine you are pulled over for a minor speeding violation. You already know why you were stopped. The officer asks for your license, registration, and insurance. You reach into the glove compartment quickly, maybe a little too quickly. Papers rustle. Your breathing is slightly uneven. You're trying to be polite, but you're also thinking about getting it over with as fast as possible. From your perspective, you are cooperating. From the officer's perspective, they are quietly noting every detail. Not because you are guilty of anything beyond speeding, but because stress responses often show up in predictable ways. Rapid movements, avoiding eye contact, over-explaining, nervous laughter. These are not crimes, but they do affect how cautiously an officer proceeds. Now here is something most driving schools never explain clearly enough. During a traffic stop in the United States, you generally are required to provide basic identifying documents like your driver's license, vehicle registration, and proof of insurance. But beyond that, conversation becomes a different category entirely. Officers may ask where you are going, where you are coming from, or if you know why you were stopped. These questions often feel casual, but they serve a purpose. They help establish baseline behavior. And here is where things get tricky for many drivers. Because people assume they must answer everything. They feel obligated to justify themselves. They start explaining their whole trip, their entire day, their intentions, sometimes even things that were never asked. The more they talk, the more details they give, the more they unknowingly create opportunities for confusion or contradiction. On the other side, some drivers go completely silent. They shut down, refuse to engage, or respond with one-word answers. That can also shift the tone of the interaction, because officers are trained to interpret communication patterns, not just words. The balance is where most people struggle. Now, imagine another situation. You are a passenger in the vehicle. The driver is calm, but the officer starts asking you questions directly. Where are you coming from? Do you know why you were stopped? This surprises you. You didn't expect to be involved at all. This happens more often than people realize, and it confuses drivers and passengers alike, because they assume only the driver is involved. But officers may question passengers as part of understanding the overall situation in the vehicle. The law treats passengers differently, but the interaction on the roadside does not always feel that way in the moment, and this is where tension can build quietly. Now let's talk about a moment that escalates many stops more than people expect: document handling. You hand over your papers. The officer takes them back to their vehicle, and now there is silence. Sometimes for a short time, sometimes longer than you are comfortable with. You start wondering what they are doing, running checks, verifying information, possibly writing a citation. This waiting period is where anxiety grows, and in that anxiety, drivers often make another mistake. They start trying to predict or interrupt the process. They look back at the officer's vehicle repeatedly. They shift in their seat. They prepare explanations they are not asked for yet. From the officer's perspective, nothing unusual is happening. From the driver's perspective, everything feels uncertain. Now consider a different scenario. The officer returns, but instead of immediately returning your documents, they start asking more questions. Maybe about your travel route, maybe about your destination, maybe about whether there is anything illegal in the vehicle. This is where many drivers feel pressure they are not prepared for, because they assume every question has a single correct answer that will immediately end the stop. But in reality, officers are often continuing to assess consistency, clarity, and behavior. And here is something important that most people only learn the hard way. Being calm does not mean being passive, and being respectful does not mean surrendering all personal boundaries. There is a difference between cooperation and overexposure of information. Now let's move into something that creates even more confusion: being asked to step out of the vehicle. Many drivers interpret this as a sign of serious trouble. In reality, officers in the United States are legally allowed to ask drivers to exit the vehicle during a lawful traffic stop. This does not automatically mean arrest. It is often a safety procedure. It changes the dynamic of the interaction. It gives the officer better control of the environment. But for the driver, it feels escalated. You step out, you stand on the roadside, cars passing, lights flashing. The officer now has a different angle on your behavior, your movements, your tone. And this is where body language becomes even more important than before. Because now, you are not just a driver in a seat. You are an individual fully exposed in a controlled environment, and every movement is more visible. This is also where misunderstandings happen. A driver may feel they are being treated unfairly and begin to argue. The officer may interpret raised voice or sudden gestures as escalation risk. The situation shifts, not because of legal guilt, but because of perceived control issues. And perception, in traffic stops, often moves faster than facts. Let's talk about another scenario that surprises many new drivers: consent searches. An officer may ask if they can search your vehicle. Many people do not realize that you have the right to refuse consent. But refusing does not always end the stop immediately. It may lead to further legal steps depending on the situation and what the officer has observed. This is where people often misunderstand their rights. They think refusal automatically means confrontation. It does not, but it does change the path of the interaction. Now think about how officers interpret hesitation. A long pause before answering a simple question, repeated looking away, overly rigid posture. These are not evidence of wrongdoing, but they are signals officers are trained to notice because roadside environments are unpredictable. And that brings us to the most misunderstood part of all: silence. Many drivers think staying silent protects them from making mistakes, and in some cases it can. But silence without awareness of context can also create tension, because communication is not just about words, it is about flow. A completely shut down interaction can sometimes make officers more cautious, not less. On the other hand, over-talking creates its own risks. The more you speak, the more chances there are for misinterpretation or unnecessary detail. So what actually works in real-world scenarios is controlled communication. Answer what is required, stay calm, avoid speculation, avoid emotional escalation, and most importantly, understand that the officer is also operating under procedures, expectations, and safety considerations that you cannot always see from inside your vehicle. Now let's address a myth that causes a lot of unnecessary fear among new drivers: the idea that any mistake automatically leads to arrest or serious consequences. In reality, most traffic stops are resolved through warnings or citations. But what determines the outcome is rarely just the violation itself. It is how the interaction unfolds. Did the driver cooperate with basic requests? Did the documents match? Did the behavior remain consistent? Did anything in the situation raise additional concerns? These are the silent factors that influence the outcome far more than people realize. Another common mistake is trying to argue legal technicalities on the roadside. Even if a driver is partially correct, a traffic stop is not a courtroom. Officers are not there to debate law in real time. That process happens later if necessary. Trying to turn a roadside stop into a legal argument often increases frustration on both sides and rarely improves the immediate situation. There is also the emotional layer that people underestimate. Stress changes communication. Fear changes tone. Even anger that feels justified in the moment can shift how a conversation develops. Officers are trained to remain controlled, but they are also human, and tone affects interaction flow more than most drivers realize. Now step back and think about the bigger picture. Driving in the United States is not just about knowing road signs or speed limits. It is about understanding that every time you get behind the wheel, you are operating within a structured system of observation, expectation, and accountability. Most of the time, nothing happens. You drive, you arrive, you move on. But when something interrupts that flow, your behavior becomes part of the outcome. That is why small decisions matter more than they seem. A delayed signal, a distracted glance, a rushed movement when handing over documents. None of these are crimes on their own, but together they shape perception. And perception shapes the entire roadside experience. If there is one thing experienced drivers slowly learn over time, it is this: control the controllable. Your tone, your movements, your clarity, your patience. Not because you are submitting to authority in a blind way, but because you are reducing unnecessary friction in a situation that is already structured, already time-sensitive, already sensitive to misinterpretation. And yet, even with all of this understanding, every traffic stop is still unpredictable in its emotional texture. Some are quick and professional, some feel tense for no clear reason. Some leave drivers replaying every moment afterward, wondering if they said too much or too little. That uncertainty is exactly why understanding road rules is not enough on its own. You also need to understand human behavior under pressure, both yours and theirs. Because when those blue lights appear again in your mirror, what happens next is never just about the violation. It is about everything that unfolds in the quiet space between two people trying to interpret each other in real time, on the side of a road, with traffic moving past like nothing unusual is happening at all.